This is Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. And now your host, Michael O'Fallon.
We are being transitioned out of an objective, true, real, physical world and shoved forcibly into a subjective, postmodern, fake digital world. A world that is based upon the criteria of operational success as defined by the puppet masters of the world. And less of a world that is based upon the combined will of the people who desire freedom, who yearn for freedom, who desire a world based on self-determination. Because for decades, those that have decided that they must play God and create a new world in an order that those who desire to be God in the near future can play God. A God that creates humanity 2.0. A God that sovereignly determines the course of history. A God that can deliver eternal life to those that are worthy. Those that are chosen. And you are caught in the middle of this transition. You and your spouse, your children, and your collective future and the future of mankind are at a crossroads. And it isn't just the big paradigm-shifting problems that are affecting your ability to live your life. It is the little things, too, because as putting food on the table and paying your bills becomes increasingly more difficult, try to remember that this hardship that is coming your way was strategically planned. And I also want you to think back to 2019 or 2018. What was your life like then? See, because capitalism was making the average man's life better. Health, wealth, and a good life was possible for everyone under capitalism. Because each sovereign individual was under the law of liberty and self-determination. No one would ever trade a good, stable, and prosperous life for this new form of dengism or distributism. You know, what Klaus Schwab, Elizabeth Warren, and Marco Rubio call inclusive capitalism, or stakeholder capitalism, which is just a form of corporate socialism. So the average man's good life, stability in his society, and his opportunities to prosper needed to be disrupted and dismantled. So men needed to be put in a bleak situation where hope and prosperity would be challenged. And now, with capitalism being challenged by those whose communo-fascist dreams are built upon what was built by free market capitalism, the average man has become desperate, worried, and unsure about his future. Men want to know the future, want to plan for their future, and want to know that their efforts are not in vain. And now, in just a few years' time, as the environment around all of us is much darker, the sellers of communitarianism and integralism have come selling future promises of safety, protection, and vengeance. And now what was completely unthinkable just 4 years ago has now become thinkable. And men will begin to embrace the false promises of socialism and authoritarianism. They will actually speak well of tyranny on both the woke left side of political Machiavellianism and the woke right side of this dialectical strategy. So what Marcuse and Horkheimer and others thought was an impossibility just a few decades ago is now completely plausible. The common man will now begin to reject capitalism and independence for communitarianism, integralism, and tyranny. And it was all strategically planned. Planned by the World Economic Forum, planned by their partners at the United Nations, planned by the tech lords, and planned by massive corporations, planned by your trusted religious leaders, planned by the CCP, and planned by nefarious members of our own government. You see, you were the focus of the Great Reset, because the Great Reset is primarily about resetting you. All of the changes and transitions around you were about forcing you to embrace change out of pure desperation. You are being funneled into accepting by force communofascism, dengism, as my friend James Lindsay has so well described. Resist with all of the strength that you have against this change. refuse to be funneled into their plans, stand up against the reflexive mobs on social media. You see, because it's time for you, no matter where you are in the United States, it's time for you to play the man. And that begins now. And that begins with your vote for Donald Trump in the 2024 election. It continues with your demand that the Trump administration is free from those that would derail our constitutional rights, protected from those that would seek to impose an integralist framework on our nation. But you must vote for Donald Trump. But that will only help if we actually have a constitutional presidential election. And I say this because the 2020 presidential election did not take place. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, I am being a bit Baudrillardian here, but the 2020 presidential election did not take place. It didn't happen. A simulacra of a presidential election took place. This doesn't mean that people did not line up to vote. And this doesn't mean that there weren't millions and millions of ballots cast. But it was all a show. It was an alchemical show. Now, I tried to explain this in my podcast, The Great Reset, that I released on November 2nd, 2020, the day before the simulation of the presidential election. And if you think back to 2020, the mainstream media was all ready to go. Fox News even had their worst and dullest on the job. And then all of a sudden, as 7 p.m. hit, and I was leading an election show, actually. We were doing a full watch party at a Marriott in Clearwater, Florida. And then, as 7 p.m. hit, they were already throwing Virginia into the Biden win column before any results had come in. Yeah, it's just Virginia's going to go to Biden. It's going to go to Biden. This is on Fox News. And in the battleground states where Trump was leading, all of a sudden, we are told that there was a major flood in one of the Atlanta, Georgia voting precincts. And for the sake of the lives of the men and women who are counting votes, they're going to have to shut down. Yeah, we got to shut everything down here in Fulton County. And in other swing states, there were just a lot of votes to count, and we're going to have to finish this counting up on Wednesday, even though Trump is in the lead. And golly, we're going to have to put up barriers to make sure that the poll watchers cannot watch what we are doing. And wow, in some places in Michigan and California, they had more votes for Biden than they had legal registered voters in their districts. I mean, wow, what a turnout. More votes than you actually have voters. And on social media, you weren't allowed to question the results of the super safe and super secure 2020 election. I mean, even President Trump's DHS head, Chad Wolf, said that the 2020 presidential election was the most secure election in U.S. history. And Chad Wolf went on to defend Christopher Krebs. And just on a side note here, it's shocking for me to see Chad Wolf as part of the America First Policy Institute, by the way. So anyway, and then just a few days later, the mainstream media began to name Joe Biden as the president-elect. Voting irregularities weren't just in California. They were in Arizona, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and some of the most egregious voting irregularities were in Georgia. You remember that flood that I mentioned just a few minutes ago? Well, that was a broken urinal. Yes, the entirety of the process of counting votes supposedly had to be shut down because of a broken urinal in Fulton County. Yeah, and so the entirety of media, social media, etc. was telling you will not be allowed to doubt the simulacra of an election on November 3rd. And that's because the 2020 election never actually took place. Oh, there were people standing in lines, voting. But it wasn't an election. You were not allowed to talk about how the entire process was dubious. And social media clamped down on election deniers. So basically the same suppression of free speech that happened just after the simulated election in 2020 that had happened during the previous months of people like me having many of my articles and podcasts taken down because of the, if you recall, the public health crisis in 2020. Well, that was the warfare tool to crush capitalism and liberty of free people. and to eventually start the process towards an authoritarian technocratic society. And this process would end up with the dismantling of America and the rise of China, the BRICS nations, and the member nations of the Belt and Road Initiative of China. You see, it was time for global equity to take place. And so, there was a rally in front of the White House on January 6th. And sadly, as has already been admitted, there were a bunch of agitating propagandists that were in the crowd, encouraging all the people gathered to storm the Capitol, like Ray Epps, like Groiperhead Nick Fuentes. And so this led to a bunch of hyperbole, and now was the cause for Congress, the FBI, etc., to start rounding up people who oppose the incoming regime. Now, I want to remind you that this happened while President Trump was still in office. He was the president of the United States. But this entire stupid, fake plan was scripted. And this, of course, led to, on January 7th, for the sitting president of the United States to be censored and banned from Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms, while he was still the sitting president. Don't ever forget that. The mainstream media and the social media giants censored and banned the sitting president of the United States of America. That was the year that was 2020 to early 2021. And this entire saga that tore America apart, from the mythical public health crisis, to the attempt to start a cultural revolution with George Floyd, to the simulacra of an election, to the drama of the false narrative of the election, to the magical mystery juice mandates, and the push for sustainability, were all scripted, strategized. All of these false narratives meant to destabilize the United States and install a president and a vice president who would not be actively making any decisions on their own. They would be reading scripts, because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were not in charge. We already had a technocracy in charge of the United States. And this even started back in the Trump administration, and Donald Trump was not aware that he actually didn't have control. And this technocracy filled all sorts of cabinet positions in the Biden-Harris administration, taken by former members of BlackRock, Open Societies Foundations, Tides Foundations, the Council on Foreign Relations, and from all sorts of other China-friendly, UN-friendly, and World Economic-friendly involved groups. They were the ones who are now running the nation and running our military into the ground, embarrassing the United States of America. Don't forget what happened in Afghanistan in 2021. Well, not just that, but they also control the security and intelligence apparatus of the current administration. But that is the same story for America since the 1960s. This is what Eisenhower warned about his last speech as president. So when we're discussing the presidential election of 2024 as we are today, you have to realize that Kamala Harris, whose father, by the way, was a Marxist, is not really the one who would be making decisions. I doubt she can make a decision about what she's going to have for breakfast. It's obviously that she doesn't make good decisions all the time. Nor would Tim Walz, the Manchurian candidate. What you would be electing if you vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are two actors that would be playing the roles of president and vice president of the United States, reading the scripts of the powerful organizations and think tanks that are guiding the United States into a shock-to-the-system period of degrowth. The two actors for this pre-prepared journey want to leap forward into what can be unburdened by what has been, and then turned into what can be, which is a future without work, a future of the creative class and universal basic income, a future where America is not first or even second, but 130th, a future where America is not the United States anymore, a future where China and the BRICS nations are now the multipolar leaders of the planet Earth. And the way that they would achieve this is by you reacting to their nonsense on November 5th and 6th and beyond. Or You're reacting to their nonsense if Trump wins decidedly. And if you ever thought that I would say something differently, you won't. Trump must win. You must cast your vote for Donald J. Trump for President of the United States. He must win, and win both in the Electoral College and also the popular vote. And if he does win, then we have to go back to work. We have to get to work. Because I believe that Mr. Trump honestly and truly wants the best for America. I believe he wants America to be a success. To be the great America that led the world just a few years ago. The America that triumphs over tyranny will be an America that will lead nations away from the control of the Chinese Communist Party, away from the degrowth models of the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, away from the woke left fantasies of Teilhard de Chardin's Omega Point. We need Donald Trump to win in 2024. The world needs Donald Trump to win in 2024. But there is a cautionary tale as well that I need to tell, because we need to protect Donald Trump's vision for America. And if Donald Trump wins, we will need to protect his vision for America from those deceitful men and women that are attempting to cozy up to Donald Trump for cabinet positions today, just like 2016 through 2020. Because, yes, Donald Trump had to fight against the Marxist Democrats in his first administration. There's no doubt. We all saw that. And yes, Donald Trump had to fight against the neoconservative Republicans in his first administration. That was enlightening for many of you. But some of the most vicious attacks, and ultimately the death blows that would take down the entire nation, came from people that were in Donald Trump's cabinet in his first administration. So let's recall some of these, and there were many. They were legion. People like John Bolton, the neocon warhawk that wanted to just feed the military-industrial complex. Or Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense that infused wokeness and critical race theory into the military during the Trump administration. And I tried to warn the administration about Esper. Unfortunately, they didn't listen at the time. And by the way, Esper came, he was at once at the Heritage Foundation. Let's not forget that. Another would be Bill Barr, who urged prisons to release prisoners during COVID and completely ignored obvious fraud during the 2020 election. I mean, he literally threw Donald Trump under the bus. Or let's not forget Surgeon General Dr. Jerome Adams, who introduced health equity, medical Marxism, into the United States in the Trump administration. And I tried to warn them about him as well. And I was told, oh, you misunderstand him. He's just a good Catholic boy. No, this is a guy that was talking to Ed Stetzer in 2020. I should also mention Mike Pompeo, who continued on with the implementation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the Dirty Tricks campaigns during his time at the CIA and the State Department. Or how about Chris Wray, who's still in office in the FBI, who should be immediately dismissed when Trump takes office? Chris Wray, who colluded with the Biden-Harris DOJ to hunt down people who protested on January 6th. I mean, heck, the feds were involved on January 6th. That's already an established fact. Or how about the big one, Mike Pence, who was collaborating with Russell Moore, who was at the time the point man on the coronavirus task force that ultimately shut down the nation. Yeah, Mike Pence, who would not do what is objectively right, but instead threw President Trump under the bus. Or how about Kristen Nielsen? Kristen Nielsen, who was appointed as the head of the Department of Homeland Security, where illegal immigration rose during her tenure. You see, the problem is that President Trump thought that these horrible people would work hard for him and forward his agenda. But this was the last priority for most of these swampish appointments. They were all part of the same Washington machine that was colluding with their Democrat counterparts to disrupt and dismantle the United States. And don't think that this has changed at all, or that there's not people that are within the America First Policy Institute that are not going to try to do the same thing. And that's why I say today, Donald Trump, if he wins, is faced with a similar issue. For instance, when I heard last July that Trump's final 3 candidates for vice president were Doug Burgum, J.D. Vance, and Marco Rubio, I just about fell out of my chair. I mean, where on the list was Dr. Rand Paul? a medical doctor and constitutionalist who was the main restraining force against medical tyranny in the Senate. Or what about Dr. Ben Carson, a brain surgeon who as well resisted the insanity of COVID, who did a great job in the position that he had in the last administration? Or Mike Lee, a brilliant legal mind, or even Sarah Huckabee Sanders? No, we were left with Marco Rubio, a neocon progressive who has been pushing for the end of capitalism and the embrace of distributism, stakeholder capitalism, which is the same economic model of Klaus Schwab and Elizabeth Warren. No, really. Who the heck was advising Trump on this? And Doug Burgum? I can't even say his name right. Need I say more? And then J.D. Vance, who was Mr. Hillbilly Elegy, who was a recent convert to traditional Catholicism, who has been hanging out with the radical integralist crowd, who clearly doesn't mind using fertile fallacies to score points, who has started down the historical deconstruction road with criticism of Ronald Reagan. So we are now in the same position that we were in during the 2016 election, because Pence was a horrible pick. Pence would valiantly lead America into Russell Moore's vision for America if something had happened to President Trump. Think about that. If anything health-wise had happened to Trump, Mike Pence would have been the president of the United States. And there would be no reason to do the whole election shenanigans that they had in 2020, because Pence would do the exact same thing that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden would do, but he would do it with a conservative mask on. Make no mistake about it, J.D. Vance might actually be worse. And not to mention some of the crowd from Claremont and Heritage who would love to have influence in the White House in the next 4 years. The Trump White House must be guarded from the worm tongues who would seek to displace Trump's vision for America for their integralist singularity dreams. And speaking of which, that is exactly the road that Tucker Carlson has been heading down the last 2 years. Yeah, all sorts of people are upset at me for just mentioning the obvious. And these are some of the people who have attempted to surround Trump over the past year. For instance, Elon Musk, who, by the way, I'm very glad that he purchased Twitter, is still a man who supports the sustainability cult and the march to net zero. I would absolutely object to Musk having a role as an efficiency czar over businesses. Now, have Musk over a task force for essential infrastructure like Boeing, sure. And having a task force on faith? Well, sure, if it is concerned with protecting religious liberty, sure. But not if it is bringing in Roman Catholic influence from the thoroughly corrupt woke Vatican or from the thoroughly corrupt Southern Baptist Convention. So, if Trump can get back to real business, the business that he knows how to do, to make things great, and he can. I've done business with Donald Trump. He does a good job. And if Donald Trump can get us back to the America that makes sense pragmatically, to make sure that we have cheap energy, a strong dollar, full liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of Americans to express their views, even if they're unpopular, for him to unleash a meritocracy, to help other nations as well who are watching us do this, to see that there is a way outside of the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party, the United Nations, and the World Economic Forum. That yoke that's put on their neck with the Belt and Road Initiative, that there's another way. And then we very well may have a way to make America great again. So what are the scenarios that I see happening as results start coming in on the evening of November 5th and most likely the week thereafter? Well, here goes. And these are not pleasant, but I'm being totally straight with you. Scenario 1. Scenario 1 would be that there would be obvious, blatant, completely exposed cheating by the Democrats and Harris, and then she is declared the victor. Videos of the cheating circulates all over social media. Conservatives then, of course, are furious and they're encouraged to take up arms. And they're encouraged to take up arms by groups affiliated with Christian nationalists and other online conservative giant Twitter handle type of folks. These online influencers will begin to stoke up the anger, and then all hell breaks loose. Then the DOJ labels anyone who's conservative and Christian as a person of interest. Fighting escalates and the military splits into two factions. Millions of military-aged illegal immigrants then as well from all over the world jump in and ignite complete chaos. The nation is completely destabilized, and eventually micronations are formed, and we end the United States of America. That's scenario 1. Scenario 2. Trump wins handily, but the Democrats begin a completely new level of lawfare in an attempt to decertify the election results. If the Republicans lose the House, then the new House will immediately begin impeachment proceedings as soon as they are sworn in. The Supreme Court jumps in, forces a transition of power, but the Biden-Harris administration refuses to recognize the decision. Violence is encouraged again from the woke left that eventually leads to a woke right violent reaction, and we sort of end up in the same situation as scenario 1. At the same time that all this is happening, of course, China decides to take Taiwan as the U.S. and its allies are in utter chaos. Scenario 3. Trump wins handily. There is some resistance from Dems in the House and Senate in regards to certification of his presidency. And then a lot of smoke and bluster happens, but Trump is sworn in. And with Donald Trump begins action to remove illegal migrants in the nation, then violence begins. In response to that violence, the woke right militias begin to respond. The woke left then uses the opportunity to call Trump Hitler, and all hell breaks loose, literally making the St. George Floyd riots of 2020 seem like a peaceful protest. That's scenario 3. Scenario 4. Trump wins handily. A normal transition occurs. However, the Biden administration destroys the economy in November and December of 2024 and leaves Trump with an economic depression. Trump's cabinet is formed, but within the cabinet are subversive elements that will try to accomplish what the left's goals were, but they're going to do so on the right. They are the woke right. Trump doesn't see it at first, but begins to become aware of the move towards the singularity and sustainability. Then Trump is encouraged to be an unbound executive by his right woke cabinet members and possibly takes a step too far. And who knows where it goes from there. And I would ask you to think back to last year in regards to what films have been created. Films that encourage the idea of civil war breaking out in the United States. And that's called Operational Preparation of the Environment. We've been talking about that for 5 years now. Well, they want to spark a dialectical conflict that ends our constitutional republic and installs a new social contract. All throughout mainstream media, they're discussing a possibility of civil war. I mean, if you tuned into ABC, CBS, CNN, if you were watching the BBC, they're talking about the possibility of civil war. And as well, social media influencers are saying, this is my first civil war. What should I wear today? They're attempting to normalize the thought of Americans going to war with one another. You must squash this kind of talk wherever it starts. See, if we ourselves are the ones that bring our constitutional republic to an end, if we allow those enemies of liberty and freedom to stoke our biases and prejudices through identity politics, and if we allow ourselves to go to war with one another by their not so subtle manipulations and propaganda that have encouraged men to go to war and break the United States of America, then we ourselves would end our great republic. Ladies and gentlemen, you must resist this call because it will end in death and tyranny for you, for your family, and for humanity itself. And I pray that this will not be the end of inalienable rights and freedoms in America. I pray that Donald Trump will be elected as the President of the United States. I pray that the evil that is planned for the next 2 months is restrained. But you know I've been warning about this for many years, this exact scenario. But you and I are in a turning point in history. Ronald Reagan said many decades ago this, and this is a great way to end the show. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of the enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire, the shot heard around the world? The martyrs of history were not fools, and our honored dead who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis didn't die in vain. Where, then, is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I had the courage to say to our enemies, "There is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance." Winston Churchill said, quote, "The destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals." And he said, "There's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells our duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness." Vote for Donald Trump. Pray for our nation. This is Michael O'Fallon, and this has been Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic.